Hi and welcome back to the channel on this very chilly winter morning. And today we are going to talk about this very simple piece of metal and how it changed the course of rallying history forever. So let's delve into the history of rallying and how this simple device came about. We've got to wind the clock back to the 1980s, a decade with big hair, big shoulder pads and big horsepower rally cars. It was considered the decade of excess, and that was certainly true in rallying in Group B. Basically what happened was the three L's had come in with the Group B. Little, light and ludicrously powerful. And yes, they certainly were. In the early days of Group B, the cars were producing somewhere around 300, 350 horsepower. However, that soon accelerated, pardon the pun, to 400, 450, 600 horsepower. And towards the end of the days of Group B, there was rumours that there was 800 odd horsepower in the rally cars. It was extremely dangerous, and it turned out cars that became missiles that ended up killing drivers and spectators. FISA, which was the governing body at the time, cancelled the Group B era and then said that's it at the end of 1986, and therefore in 1987 a new formula would come in which would become Group A. And in a lot of regards we still follow the Group A rules with cars these days. Basically, Group A was production based, so therefore manufacturers had to produce the car as a road car, and they had to make minimum numbers, and it was in the thousands rather than just a couple of hundred of them. And therefore, because of all the constraints around road cars and the production costs, it would theoretically limit the performance of the cars. And in the early days, it worked very successfully. And like everything, time and technology moves on, and it wasn't long before Group A started to become quicker or as quick as Group B cars, and power outputs started to increase. The FIA was then concerned again that power outputs might reach the levels of Group B, and so therefore they brought in this, the Turbo Inlet Air Restrictor. A simple device with zero moving parts in it that is very, very effective at limiting horsepower. So let's have a look at how these things work, what they do, where they go in the car, and why they're so effective. So for comparison, this is a VF turbocharger compressor housing versus the restrictor. Now the turbo housing has a reasonable size opening on it, say it's about 50 millimeters. However, the restrictor hole, as you can see, is much smaller, in this case 36 millimeters. And the rules state that all air ingested by the engine must pass through this restrictor. It has to be fitted within 50 millimeters of the compressor blade, so therefore we've had to machine the compressor housing to make sure it fits in the correct location, and it must be airtight, so we're going to seal it and lock it into place. Now at this point you might be wondering, how does the restrictor actually reduce the power of the engine? Well, you need air, or rather oxygen, to burn with the fuel to produce power. So if you limit the amount of air, you then limit the amount of power that the engine can generate. Yeah, okay. However, we're turbocharging the engine. A turbocharger is like a vacuum cleaner and a compressor. So why not just turn the boost up? In other words, make the turbocharger suck more air in. That'll fix the problem. And that, ladies and gents, is where the restrictor is very clever. You see, air is very weird and very cool stuff at the same time. And to explain this, we need to turn to something very similar to a turbocharger, a jet engine. Since the days of World War II, engineers have known about the principles of air and how to compress it, particularly when it comes to jet engines. And if we look at probably one of the most famous jet aircraft, the SR-71 Blackbird, they had to come up with some very clever tricks to get around the effects of air at very high speeds. As air starts to speed up, the molecules start to bump into each other more as they compress, causing turbulence, which actually slows the airspeed down. Therefore, there's a limit to the volume and speed of the air that you can draw through the restrictor. And whilst engineers have found ways to overcome that with jet engines, the rules in rallying pretty much outlaw any modification, so the restrictor does its job. And that's why if you draw too much air through too small an opening, you end up actually reducing performance. The history of turbo restrictors doesn't end there. Again, let's take a step back in time. By the mid-90s, Group A had fully matured and four-wheel drive and turbocharging was the norm, and therefore the restrictors played an integral part in keeping the playing field relatively level amongst the major manufacturers. There is, however, one infamous exception. Ford, Mitsubishi and Subaru had all developed smaller, lighter Group A cars in the form of the Escort Cosworth, the Lancer Evolution and of course the Impreza WRX. However, Toyota, they were kind of going in the other direction. The Celica was getting bigger and heavier as the models progressed. And so with a bigger, heavier car and a cap on the horsepower, Toyota was at a distinct disadvantage. And so their solution to the problem was to cheat. Toyota devised an ingenious and extremely well-engineered restrictor, well, kind of, that actually allowed air to be bypassed when it was clamped into position in front of the turbo. However, when the hose clamps were released and it was open for inspection, it snapped back into place and appeared like a full restrictor. The device was discovered towards the end of the '95 season and Toyota was banned with immediate effect. Subaru and Colin McRae went on to win the World Rally Championship that year. Well then, how much power can you produce if you've got a restrictor on the front of the turbo? The theoretical limit is around 300 horsepower, and that's what we see with some of the turbocharged cars when we've got them on the dyno. Okay, just one last step with this before we finish up the video. All restrictors need to be inspected by the scrutineers to make sure they comply, and then they lock wire it in place with a special crimp in a process known as turbo sealing. The idea of the seal is to allow the scrutineers to just check it at any time during an event without needing to remove the whole turbo off the car, and if installed correctly, the lock wire would have to be cut to remove the restrictor. Okay, so hopefully that's cleared up what a turbo inlet air restrictors are. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Haven't put one out for a little while, been busy doing other things. We're actually getting ready for the Grimwade Stages Rally, which is, well, the end of this week actually. So therefore, we'll have another video out very shortly. Please like, give us a thumbs up and subscribe, and we'll catch you again soon. Cheers.